Hello and welcome everyone to our next episode of Help and Trade podcast, where we give space to entrepreneurs and their startups. My today's guest is Tal Friedman. Tal is an entrepreneur from Israel and I'm really excited to talk to him. We met together on the Klimaton Challenge a couple of months ago, and now it's time to introduce his startups, his venture, what is he up to. And yeah, Tal, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. First of all, it's great to be here and to make a continuation of our initial meeting. I was really glad also to learn about what you're doing with Help and Trade, and yeah, very happy to have this stage. So I'll introduce myself in a few sentences. I'm an entrepreneur, construction tech entrepreneur. I have a startup called Foldstruct, which deals with digital fabrication for architecture using algorithms, robotic fabrication, something we'll go into a little bit deeper as the discussion moves along. And I also work in various other positions in this sector. But I think for an intro that's enough.
Yes, definitely. There's a lot going on in your life. I can say from our discussion so far, I'm really impressed by how you even manage to have time to do all the things at the same time. But let's focus first. First of all, your path to entrepreneurship.
Okay, so that's actually a very interesting question because by profession, as I mentioned, I'm an architect. An architect, I think, unfortunately, is very, very far from the path of entrepreneurship. And it's something that really took me a long time to understand that in order to make the impact of an architect, planner, designer, you have to walk through the path of entrepreneurship. The main reason for that is that the building industry is a very closed industry with its own rule sets. And when you want to make an impact and change some of those rules, you really have to, I would say, create your own path. And that's what led me in the beginning to, I would say, learning more and saying, okay, the knowledge that I have enough is not sufficient. And after you learn more, you understand that you also have to act and sometimes be a rebellion in a way. And that's what led me to my path of entrepreneurship.
Did you start your entrepreneurship in Israel or in Germany after your studies?
So actually, I started it all the way back in Israel, but it was, I would say, kind of, I was an entrepreneur in my mind, but I was still working for a company. I worked for large architecture firms and I was brought in as an architect to bring my specialty knowledge, which is digital design, freeform architecture. For our viewers who are not kind of in the scene, I'll just explain what that means. So we have mainstream buildings, which are just kind of repetitive cubes. And then we have the whole field of what is now being referred to as star architecture, which is very extravagant buildings, things that are out of the ordinary. And they require us to also build out of the box and use advanced technologies which are not feasible for the mainstream. So on the one hand, we can design whatever we want on the computer. When we bring them on site, completely different question. And those blobs, 3D forms very, very quickly become cubes. And I think this was my kind of first path into entrepreneurship. I worked for these offices. They brought me in order to create these designs. And then very, very slowly, I began to understand that, that's only an initial design. It's never going to be built. And that's how I kind of developed my own mechanisms, went to study in Germany for a master's because I understood that with the set of rules and the knowledge that I have, I would not be able to pursue a career building these things. I would only be doing designs for competitions and things like that. So yes, I started in Israel, and then after studying, I did a project with a large German company called Bond on testing new fabrication technologies. And after that, basically, I became to the path of I would say, a completely standalone entrepreneur with a startup.
I saw on one of your social media channels, maybe it was LinkedIn, one of your results of your work, the foldable structure which you then constructed together. I'm not sure what was the purpose exactly. I saw the short loop video to it as well. Was it done in Germany? Was it in Israel? And what was the purpose behind it?
Okay, great question. So that leads me exactly to what I talked about, the collaboration with the industrial company. And the idea there was to ask, how can we take industry standard sheet materials, which are now just used as flat panels, and create three-dimensional forms without the heavy costs involved? So just to explain what this is all about. So when you want to build complex designs, it usually has to do with a lot of little segments that are then connected together in some sort of a 3D puzzle. It was actually a story from my old office where I would design these things, and then they came to me and said, Tal, what you're designing looks really cool, but you're designing it from segment, like thousands of different little segments, and we can't produce these segments. So you have to think in big flat panels. And so the idea that I went away with Israel in my mind was, how do I create 3D forms from single flat elements in order to still answer the question of I'm manufacturing by using large sheet material, but on the other hand, I'm still getting those complex forms. And the idea was to use origami techniques, which allow you to fold things into form. And by folding, you reduce the need to create heavy fabrication, substructure, welding. So imagine a piece of paper that you just take it with your hands, and then it gets folded to any 3D form that you want. So that was the initial concept. We have a bit more time, so later I'll explain more into that, because that was actually the stepping stone for the whole Foldstruct project. And it was done at the University of Detmold with the help of a Lucobond that I mentioned, which is a large German company producing sheet material. So that was my, I would say, first dive into the actual screw and material that I lacked so much as a designer being on the computer.
I must say, it reminded me of something I saw also in London, one of the big train stations over there. Organic structures which looked kind of like a rainforest in order to support the roof as well. And that kind of reminded me of what you designed. So I was wondering, where do you get also the inspiration for the designs you create in Foldstruct?
I think what you're talking about is exactly the age of freeform architecture, where we are no longer limited to a flat roof, and we can talk about columns that look like trees, and we can talk about using logic of nature to reduce material and increase the structural properties, which is very much how nature works. So this project that you mentioned is, of course, using digital fabrication, and I would say this is exactly the niche which I'm interested in penetrating, but well, we're working on different technologies of getting there. So to build this today would cost you about 10 times more than a standard building because of the heavy fabrication, and you need very, very special cuts in various angles, and you need a lot of skilled labor. And the idea was to really go down that path, because in the end, that's what people want. You know, people are attracted to beautiful architecture. They want to be close to something that, you know, resembles nature, resembles freeform thinking. You know, we say thinking outside of the box. And it's funny that we are associating a box with thinking, which are completely two different things. So I think that's basically where we want as humans to go, to a place of more freeform design, freeform thinking. And my inspiration comes from really reaching as much freedom as possible, mimicking, I would say, the logic of nature in a sense. That pavilion resembles a flower. So if you look at it, it resembles on the one hand a flower, but on the other hand, it tests a lot of physical properties, and it also tests the possibility of creating something without a substructure using kind of a flower form, which is very, very cost efficient because it sits on a column, and then as it spreads open, you have a cantilever. So there are a lot of mathematical and geometrical principles which are actually the reason why nature chooses them to begin with. So I try to follow that logic always in my design and try to make it as appealing as possible to the user.
You said these free-form structures, they are currently costly to produce. Mm-hmm. Do you think it will change with the time to be way more affordable also for commoners, you know, for normal people? Or is it always going to be just products of luxury?
So I think it depends on us, basically. So right now it is definitely, as you mentioned, very, very expensive and completely unfeasible. And that has to be said. There are a lot of new technologies, but they are being borrowed and not developed for architecture. So when you have to borrow a robot used in the aerospace industry, and when you need to use a special expert to use that robot, you're paying a lot of money. You're paying his time worth working for Airbus, just for instance, right? And when you're talking about the fabrication times, again, you're talking about very, very high times. So it is feasible today for projects like a Beijing airport, or for, very, very high-class projects that would in the end be worth their value, mainly in big cities, public projects. But I think it will take time for it to get to the mainstream. And that's what we do in Foldstruct. We try to take current technologies and adapt them rather than borrowing expensive technologies. So how could I take a single sheet of material, wood, plastic, metal? How do I take a standard CNC router? How do I use logic in a new kind of way, right? And I work a lot with optimization algorithms and give new life to the industry standard things. I think that's where the key is, and I think we will get there. It won't look exactly the same, right? For instance, I was talking with a large fabricator who said we want smooth surfaces. It has to be smooth. And I asked, why does it have to be 100% smooth? And he says, because that's how the architect designed. And I said, okay, but if you look at it, smooth surfaces, which are 100% smooth, require unique molds. And they require, I would say, industry tools from the automotive industry, where if you pixelate it, it would still look the same from kind of, I would say, 20, 30 meters away. So you have the same effect, but you're building it in a much more cost-effective way. So I think once we really focus on what it is that we're trying to do and not mimic one-to-one a design, because designs are usually thought up in a computer. And a computer thinks in completely free-form manner and can create any smooth shape. So I think, we have to adapt our mindset to our tools and also, work on the link between the design and the fabrication. Don't design and then think how I fabricate. First think, how am I going to fabricate, and embed that to your design to create a restrained or restricted design environment and build your way up from there.
Where does the 3D printing come into foldable structures, for example? Because that's a current trend, and I saw a couple of very interesting videos where they were 3D printing houses, for example. But I see fold structures altogether not necessarily as a competing form, but more as a supplementary or even as the end result possible. That you actually 3D print individual parts and then you put them together in a foldable structure, which you then can place anywhere you want. How do you see that?
3D printing is an amazing technology which has many applications, of course. One of them, which has lately, I would say, sprouted, was concrete 3D printing. I think 3D printing at the moment is, feasible for small projects, but I think it still has some inherent problems. For instance, the rebars, the reinforcements are still a large problem, and we're very much limited in the freeform design we can do with it, which was the real reason we wanted to 3D print in the first place. So I think we really have to be careful about how we're using the technology. I think using a 3D printer to create cubes is the wrong way of using a 3D printer to begin with. It's an amazing technology, but I think, we should be very, very careful about creating a hype out of things that are just almost sucking a lot of the attention of the field, because I think there are so many other great technologies, and 3D printing should be used for freeform designs. That's what it was meant to do to begin with, to break the box. And I would definitely see ways of collaborating with 3D printing and folded structures on various levels. Also, you can 3D print flat panels with intrinsic three-dimensional properties. So it's a very interesting time, to get involved, but we also have to be critical in our thinking. And, I think the social media sometimes is doing much more harm than helping out. Because, it's taking one or two projects and kind of putting them as posters for something, and then it's very, very hard to divert the conversation because it's already out there.
I was wondering, where could you do the greatest impacts in the shortest time with your product? And your product would be a foldable structure. What do you think of that?
Of course, it's all about the impact, and the first thing we would like to do is enter the field of facades, because we think we have a lot to contribute to the way the building looks and behaves. So if in the beginning we're talking just about fabricating, now we're also talking about what we're fabricating. And using Foldstruct, you could create a lot of facade systems that would also be energy efficient, because you're kind of creating a double skin. I should say we produce with 2 to 4 millimeter thin sheets. And that means that you're actually creating a barrier between the wall and the exterior. Again, just to point it out, we're not talking about completing a building as a folded structure, but we're talking about a facade element, right? Either for cladding or as a part of a wall system. And the idea is actually to contribute to the building itself, not just make it prettier, but also use smart coatings, air barriers to produce ventilated facade systems. That's one of the first impacts we want to make because we can integrate into mainstream architecture. Since we are not limited to any type of mold, we could be attached as a plug-in to any building, new or an existing building. And I think that would have the biggest immediate impact on the built environment. Just to note, an interesting project we're working on now is a foldable pop-up house for third world countries, because I think one of the biggest advantages you have with foldable structures is the ability to not construct it, but rather fold it as a one-time process. Yeah, we've developed some mechanisms that would allow kind of a pop-up house. Of course, not a big one because we want to tackle third world countries with it. So now they're living in these little sheds. You know, if you've ever traveled to South Africa or these places, you know that it's like subhuman conditions. And if you're talking about an impact, going there and improving their life standards, not by moving them to a project, but by making a one-to-one replacement, just making a better version of what they have, could affect lives of millions of people. The UN estimates more than 1 billion people living in these, you know, I would say 10-meter sheds all around the world in township cities. I think that would be amazing to go and give an input there.
I was thinking about something very similar, a foldable structure which is easy to ship from wherever it is produced to, for example, emergency zone right after earthquakes, where you need to bring up hospitals, where you need to put up stations for sanitization, stuff like that, even toilets to begin with, for example. And those can be shipped as foldable structures where you just really need to put it up, put it together, I don't know, with screws and bolts maybe, and it's done. And you have a structure which is usable as of that moment immediately and bringing a great value. And I think that would be a great value of foldable structure to begin with.
Yeah, definitely. I think you could be our spokesperson.
It's also interesting because, for example, my brother works for the ministry in Slovakia, and he takes care of housing for example, for Roma people in Slovakia. The housing is, of course, a huge problem. Some places are just structures which are definitely not adequate to the situation or equipped with, I don't know, heating bodies inside or even isolation. So bringing a foldable structure would be something as a solution for exactly that problem, where you could say like, hey, we need to take care of the people because that's a problem which is scaling up and it's a vicious circle which you will never get out unless you have, for example, affordable roof over your head.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things we try to do is address reality as it is, you know, and living in Basel now in this area and, you know, being in privileged places, we tend to think in a very regulated way, where most of the world is completely unregulated and there are, you know, extremely harsh conditions. And I think when you want to penetrate these areas, you have to think of how they behave there. And I think if you want to make an impact, it's not about moving 5,000 people out of 10 million. You have to think, how can I create a product? You know, and that's where the entrepreneurship comes in. An architect would think of, I want to make a project, and an entrepreneur says, you know, I want to make a product. And that's a difference. People like to use this analogy between giving someone a fishing rod or teaching them how to fish, right? Or giving him a fish, sorry. I think building one-off projects is just handing people fish for dinner. And when you build products, you're teaching people how to fish. And if you create these kind of units or things that are very, very cheap and easy to assemble, no, they will not live on the same living standards as Western projects, but that's not what they're meant to do. Because you want to make an impact on millions of people, and you want to maybe sell those as foldable products through UN projects, or you want to allow people to save up and build one for themselves and build their way up. For me, at least, traveling in Africa was a huge mindset shift to understand that the regulated world is just one small way of thinking about life that exists in actually a very small part of the world if you look at the globe. So when we think about how can I use a technology to benefit lives of people, we have to think of kind of B2C in the end. You want to go directly to the customer and provide value for him.
Let's shift now the focus on you specifically. How is it going with Foldstruct so far? How is your business growing? Who is the team? What are your perspectives? And especially, how do you manage Foldstruct as your startup? And besides being also keynote speaker for the change in architecture?
time is essential problem, I find. You want to do so much, but you have so little time. And I think one thing just leads to the other. The keynote speeches are a great way to address people, but it was never my intention to be a keynote speaker or to create connections between people. One of my roles is also being an advisor for construction tech, for government organizations, private companies. And I think that's a byproduct of what I do. I basically come from the point of wanting to make things. I'm a maker in my soul. I used to be an artist. I used to be a political cartoonist in a newspaper. I worked in graphics. For me, it's all about creation and doing things. And of course, after studying architecture, you want to build. And as I said, one thing leads to the other. When you do for yourself, I would say you hustle your way into doing things, because the world doesn't want people to create. Let's put it this way. If you try to create something, you will run into a lot of brick walls. It's not meant for creators. It's meant for people that go to work from 8 o'clock to 5. And when you try to do things, you see that you have to fight for your way. And because that's what I do, then I also could provide value for others. The other thing you learn is that much more than what you do specifically, it's all about the impact and it's all about the connections with people. An artist can work in his own gallery, and then that's what I used to do, is one-off projects as an artist. And then I learned that when you want to make a real impact on society, you need partners, and you need to work with other people, and you have to create an inspiration in others. It's no longer about me. What I do is just meant to spark an inspiration in someone else and make him think, what could I do with what Tal is developing? So I think that's how I find time for everything, because in the end, one benefits the other. I could say that a lot of the upcoming projects that we have now have come from keynote talks, from articles. In the beginning of my way, I would chase down, a lot of people, hustle my way and ask, how do I reach that person or that person? And I learned that the more impact you make, the less you have to chase people, because they come to you. They see what you do, they hear about it, and everyone sees himself in what you do. How can that benefit my project? A lot of the ideas that we have today didn't come from me, but from other people that were thinking, this could benefit this and that industry. Now we have, to answer your second question about what we're doing, we're working with several companies on developing the technology further as far as patents are concerned, the robotics involved. Rather than just being an idea, we want to bring it to life. Also, product-wise, we think furniture is a great way to address the issue you were talking about, quickness. We can create furniture that is shipped flat and just brought onto site and folded by the user. So there are a lot of different industries we are addressing that are all based on the same technology.
And how does it look business-wise for you right now? Are you looking for investors? Is the business running on its own organic growth? How does that work for you as of now?
We're looking to raise capital, and we recently filed for the patents. And the patents for me are the most important thing, because they allow you to think as an entrepreneur. Like we mentioned before, right? Making a one-off project that can easily be knocked off is something which is unscalable. And I think I would be happy if people just knocked off and started really, using this as a movement. But the problem is that in order to really do this, it does take funds. And in order to get the funds, you have to be, I would say, the Coca-Cola of folded structures, to understand that there is a valid business model that is worth putting funds into. As much as you just want to spread everything out, you also have to understand that, to do all this research, you have to show a path to success, and that's what we're focusing on right now.
No, I suppose with your work on, for example, facades, you already have proof of concept. It's possible. And so far, what we talked also before, you definitely have the numbers behind to support yourself in Foldstruct and what is it doing.
Like you mentioned, facades are a very interesting field. We have a few collaborations now. The thing about construction is that it's a marathon. So when you get a project today, it gets built in 4 or 5 years away from now. That's why we're actually focusing right now on building systems that would be plug-in systems for existing homes, and working with people within the industry, also with different organizations who need to construct energy efficient housing. And there are, of course, things cooking at the moment that I'll be happy to share as soon as I can.
How do you see your current opportunities within Switzerland?
So Switzerland is actually one of the most interesting countries in terms of architecture. Besides, I think, of course, being an international country where a lot of things are happening, it's also very open to culture. We have some of the leading architecture brands. Of course, here in Basel, we have Herzog and de Meuron, who are world leaders in high quality architecture. We have Peter Zumthor, who's one of my favorite architects, also working in Switzerland. For a small country, it definitely has a lot of innovation. It also surprisingly has a lot of the building industry in it of Europe. So there are a lot of German-Swiss companies as well as Swiss corporates controlling the international construction field. And I think it's an amazing place to penetrate. We're just new here, but I definitely, from my talks with people, from projects that I see that are being built, I think it's a place that is open for innovation and has kind of the widespread understanding of well-being and how to live quality life, which is sometimes the hardest thing to do as an architect, to explain why we actually need architecture. But maybe that's for another talk.
Oh, we have as much time as you need, of course.
No, I mean, this is, I think, one of the advantages of being in Switzerland is that people are used to quality and they demand quality. In most of the built environment, I would say people are building cubes and they would make a nice museum or a nice church. I think you want to be in an environment where people are expecting the next thing and they feel entitled to it in a way. And that's, as an architect, always where you want to be.
Tal, unfortunately, we are almost out of time. Nevertheless, if you have any departure remarks for our audience, if there's something you would like to share, go ahead with it.
Yeah, so basically I know that a lot of young entrepreneurs here in Basel are listening to your podcast as well as professionals. Firstly, I want to congratulate you. I think it's a great idea to do something like this, to just pick up the bat and not wait for opportunities, but create them ourselves. It's all about connections. And if you heard my talk now and you think we can integrate it somehow, or just, if you find it interesting, feel free to reach out. I know Stefan has a lot of friends in the building industry. Yeah, I think it's young people living here. We kind of, we're living in a very interesting time, just building up an ecosystem. So I just like to congratulate you on your way and wish you a lot of success with Help and Trade, which I think is a great idea.
Thank you very much. Well, I was actually more looking forward to share specific your messages, not necessarily about me, but yes, thank you very much. I'll definitely make sure also to share your contacts via our blog and also social media, and therefore also spread the reach. And I'll be more than happy to forward you to all my contacts.
Great. Cool. So thank you very much for inviting me. It was a great chat.
Thank you very much, Tal, as well, and to our listeners. Thank you for listening and stay tuned. This was really exciting discussion, and I'm looking forward to present to you next host, probably in the next year, actually. And so, stay tuned and have a great day. Bye-bye.